I'm Greg Niemeyer. I'm a data artist. My favorite number is 23. I'm also a professor for media art at Berkeley, and I do my work because I want to increase data literacy. Data literacy means that we all know how to read, write, and make decisions based on data. And that means that we have to have a data culture, kind of like we have a cinema culture where we always go watch movies and we're ready to talk about what the movie meant to us. But we never really hang out and talk about what the data meant to us. But the data is much more important than the movie, so we have to have a culture around data just like we have culture around cinema. Data is the oil of the 21st century. It's what makes people rich, it's what makes people poor, it's what we exploit, it's what we leverage in order to gain power. And so you can choose to be part of that system of power as a participant, or you can be part of it as a servant. We all are data servants. We produce data for other companies and entities without getting any compensation for it. We are exploited, and we can turn that around by becoming data participants, people who are aware of the value of data and people who fight for the protection of their data, and also draw conclusions from their own data to make life better and to create a more vibrant community. So it's a powerful resource, and we should learn to use it. Why is 23 my favorite number? It's a prime number. I think it's a beautiful number. So 23 is my favorite number because it is the number of a studio I used to work in at Stanford, where I studied. And it was studio number 23, and I just thought that was a good, lucky number, and it never failed me since. Of course, this is selective bias, but so we get used to remembering things that happen to involve the number 23 as positive. So it's more of a selective perception that makes us feel lucky about that number rather than a real statistical thing. But it works for me. It has a good resonance. It vibrates well. I introduce myself by mentioning my favorite number sometimes because it gives me comfort to think about geometry, to think about the aesthetics of numbers, and to think about resonances as well. So it puts me in a good mood. And sometimes I learn what other people's favorite number is, and then we have a data exchange. We have a name and a number, and I think there's a deep bond there that's possible. Yeah, some people say my star sign is, my zodiac sign is so-and-so, and I'm not into that so much, but the numbers work. Well, numbers are doors to stories. Because numbers are just another way of describing the world. And if you use them well, they're openings to new kinds of stories and openings to new kinds of worldviews. They're not as polarizing, I think, as words. Sometimes words are quite polarizing. And the German philosopher Goethe said, das Wort erregt stets seinen Gegensinn. The word always introduces its contrary meaning. And so if I say black, you might think black, but you also might think white, because those two terms are tied together. And so those categories are very powerful structures that we think in, but numbers don't really work that way. They're infinite. They're irrational. they sometimes can be divided and sometimes can be multiplied. They're very fluid, and they resonate with each other in more fluent ways than words do. And they represent for me the worldview of the wave worldview. The worldview in which waves collide with each other, and as they do, they produce new shapes. And that's a very important guiding principle for me, to separate categories from waves and to think, well, when can we use categories to understand the world, and when can we use waves to understand the world, and when can waves help us go beyond the limited view of categories. That's probably also one of the reasons why I love the number 23, because it's an odd ratio, it's an unstable ratio, and it wants to interact. It's very reactive with other numbers, and it often produces odd and infinite and irrational numbers when we divide and multiply with it. And so I think that's a lot of fun. It's a reminder of how the world is really made of waves. Well, I would say most traditional art is also some kind of a data visualization, in the sense that if you have a painting, it visualizes itself. It's a representation of itself. If you think about a painter, a painting oftentimes has many layers. And so the end result, the last state of the painting, the final state of the painting, is a representation of all the things that happened before. It's a visual representation of all the things that happened before. The layers are hidden underneath, but still there's a process. And so the last state is the sum of all the previous states, and hopefully the best state of the painting. And so you could think of that as a visualization of a whole process of painting, right? Action painting is a visualization of the action of painting itself. And so data visualization is similar in the sense that we try to show a history or a process through an image, and that is not a process that is on the screen itself, but it's rather a process that's somewhere else and it's been abstracted. So for example, if I take my temperature is 36 degrees Celsius. Or something like that, and the moment I say that number, it's an abstraction. So now I've taken the temperature away from my body and I've turned it into a number. And then we abstract it again, and we make a chart and say my temperature yesterday was higher or lower, and then we have a graph that results from it. And so that's another level of abstraction. And that exists at the same time as my body still exists, and my body still has a temperature, but there's also the abstract version. So you can think of that as the data double. And then the question is, how can we make that data double as visible as the body itself, so that we can see the story of it, or the reality of it, and draw conclusions from it. And so sometimes an image helps, and a graph helps, and it helps tell the story of the data. Of course, there's a lot of data. Temperature is a very simple kind of data, but there's a lot of data out there. It's much more complex. It's not just one stream of data, it's many streams of data. And then how to show the inner relationships between many different data sets is really an active exploration. So data visualization is a way of illustrating data, but we need to do more than just illustrate data. We need to give people tools to explore data and to see how a set of data can be turned around and looked at from many sides until we see the angle that allows us to draw the conclusions we need to draw, or make the insights we need to have. So data to me is like a beautiful sculpture that you look at from many different sides until you appreciate it from many different sides, and you get different insights depending on how you look at it. And so those kinds of tools that allow us to interact with data in meaningful ways, that would be data visualization. It's not just a pretty picture, it's really a tool to work with data. Data visualization is a new art form because we have never been aware of as much data as we are now. So it's important to be precise about this. Really, the world is already describing itself very carefully. Like every object, every material, every light, every sound is a description of itself. So there's many descriptions of the world out there already. But with data, we introduce a layer of abstraction where we describe the world again as a model. And so we have the model of the world and the real world. But the model is growing more and more complex, and we never had as much information about this model of the world. Let me say it differently. The model of the world never had as much information in it as it has now. And so because there's so much information there, we now need new ways of dealing with that information and reflecting it in our culture. We've never made as many decisions before as we do now based on data. So, but there is no real culture of data. Culture is mostly an expert culture where we say, oh, statisticians deal with data, or data scientists deal with data, but they're all kept in rooms that are not accessible to the public. There's no real access to that because there is not a culture that includes that yet. So the culture is sort of behind the practice. There's a practice of data that is corporate and scientific and oftentimes quite private and secretive, and then there's a culture of data that is supposed to include that practice, but it actually is behind. And so there's a lot of work now to catch up and reflect that power of data in society and make sure that everybody in a community can access the data and work with it. So that's where the art comes in. The art is really a part of that culture. It's not the culture itself, it's just a small part of the culture. It's almost like artists go out and try out, like in a crazy kind of way, all the possible ways in which we could visualize and integrate data into our culture. And then some of these things that artists invent become part of the mainstream culture. And that's a very important process because culture always needs to adapt to the world as it changes. And so culture needs a fresh input and an inspiration. And artists have this job, a wonderful job of inventing new kinds of culture, and most of them fail. Most of them are useless, kind of like genetic modifications. Most of them are worse than the previous version, but some of them are absolutely essential. The few innovations that are absolutely essential make innovation worthwhile, the whole process of innovation worthwhile. In other words, as artists, we often explore things without really knowing what works and doesn't work. It's a chaos. And sometimes we find something that's really great, and most of the time we find a lot of noise and a lot of mistakes and a lot of false paths. But the few things that we find that are really valuable are not only valuable to the artists, but also to society as a whole. And that's how we can generate new kinds of cultures, and so that's the job, that's the work. Sometimes innovations come from different places as well. They don't have to come from official artists. They can come from anybody, from a kid playing in the sand. But it doesn't really matter where it comes from. The main thing is that it's a constant process of adapting. The key thing we need to adapt to today is dealing with data. And so that's a huge change. We never have had to do that before. A data artist plays with data all day long. And sometimes when we play, we find a new game and new rules. And those are very important insights. And we can say, oh, this is more fun than that. This is more interesting than that. And then we can push these insights forward, outward, and see if they're useful to anybody else as well. Supraliminal is a new word that we invented based on the word subliminal. Subliminal describes things that are below the threshold of perception. When something is too dark to see or too bright to see, then we can't quite make it out, and maybe we squint or we turn on a light and then we can see it. But supraliminal is above the threshold of perception, meaning that there's not too little but too much going on. And so supraliminal describes the complexity of the world and the richness of the world, and what happens when we try to take it all in, but it's too much. And so it's a story of, supraliminal is a story of starting with simple forms and allowing more complex forms to emerge until it's almost too much for us. And it's a story of going to the edge of perception in the direction of complexity rather than subtlety. The project Supraliminal began because we were excited about Alan Turing and his theory of morphogenesis. Morphogenesis theory was written in 1953, and it's a theory that was a mathematical speculation at the time, but since then it has proven to be accurate. And the theory says that you can get complex forms out of simple rules, and you can get complex forms out of simple waves of chemicals, concentrations of chemicals mixing into each other. So for example, you have a plant that has a stem, and if you cut open the stem this way, you have a ring of cells, and some of those cells will make flowers come out or leaves come out, and some cells won't. Now, what decides where the cells make flowers and leaves and where they don't? That is a question of a concentration of certain chemicals called actuators that are, the concentrations are higher in some places and lower in other places. So you can think of the concentration as a wave. And then you can think of a concentration of another chemical that describes another part of the plant as another wave. And if you have two waves overlapping, you get complex forms emerging. And so in Turing's vision, the whole world is made up of waves interacting with each other, and many, many interactions produce complex shapes. And so even something like a baby developing in the womb is actually a series of simple interactions for a very long time producing a complex result. So we start with a binary, a wave for one part of a body and a wave for another part of the body. And it goes on, and the cascade of waves that mix into each other produce the ultimate form of the human body. They also produce the pattern on your fingerprint. They also produce the shape of a galaxy. So these rules happen at different scales and have similar results at different scales. It's about distributing things in a way that they can be alive. And it's a pretty big deal. It's like, we don't know why things are alive in the first place, but we do know that the forms in which they become alive are generated through these simple waves. And so we wanted to make a project that celebrates that insight and that celebrates that worldview as well, that you can say that everything is not necessarily made of things or objects or words, categories, but it's really made of waves that constantly resonate with each other. And it's a very poetic worldview, and one that opens up to, the world to a lot of interpretations. So Supraliminal does not have any data at the beginning. It generates its own data. So we really start with a blank memory, an array of pixels that are just blank. And I probably can show that to you, but I'll tell it first and then I'll show it. Supraliminal starts with a blank memory. There is no data at the beginning. However, there are waves that collide into each other, one from the left and one from the right. And when they do, they affect each other. So if we have one that goes like this and one that goes like that, the result is that there's a line that remains that's diagonal. So from the collision of the waves, data is generated. And that data becomes part of the memory field. And then when other waves come by, those in turn affect the memory field as well. It's kind of like drawing in the sand. And as many, many more waves collide into each other, the data space becomes more complex, and eventually it becomes quite noisy. And at the very end, it looks like stars in the sky, or like a Gothic cathedral window, or like a galaxy, or like snakeskin. And so it's a direct animation of what happens when waves collide and how forms emerge from those waves. And so in this case, we start with no data, and at the end we have artificially generated data. Well, we don't start with the data. Oftentimes we start with the data set when we make art. We take data from the radiation of the sun from the last 30 years, or 800,000 years of CO2 levels from the Antarctic ice core, from the Vostok ice core. These are great data sources that tell stories about the world the way nobody else can tell stories. They go back deeper and longer, and they're very precise. And they precisely describe, for example, how climate change and ice ages have been interacting with each other over the past, as I said, 800,000 years. Those are great data sets. But but in this case, in Supraliminal, we didn't use any data at all that existed, but we rather looked at the principles by which data is generated in nature in the first place. So we're looking at the kinds of mechanisms that make the world. And so we're looking at the kinds of mechanisms that make all the data about the world as well. So the kinds of mechanisms that make the world are these kinds of collisions of layers that produce forms, and those forms then are become data. So we're looking here at the genesis of data rather than at the interpretation of data. And so in a sense, this is very much about data art because it asks, where does the data come from? The data comes from simply waves colliding. And simple as it may seem, many waves colliding for a long time produce very complex results. So this is about the genesis of data, not about using data that already exists. In Supraliminal, you don't necessarily see a wave at first. What you see is edges. But these edges, when an edge moves across a screen over time, that is a wave. It's like a wave of water coming through, like that, right? And there's another wave coming through this way. And so the foam of those two waves coming together produces a result in the middle. Or these two waves clashing produce a result in the middle. And that's where it starts. So later on, we also have waves here. For example, here there's a wave that comes by every now and then. Here's a straight edge. Here's a wave. And so it's almost like putting waves of multiple dimensions together. So waves can be flat, or they can be volumetric, and they can be sliced and diced and turned in different ways. And that is what Alan Turing's work was all about. It was about how different angles of waves interact with each other. So the lines are a simple kind of wave, and the curved lines are a more complex kind of wave. It's really in two dimensions because you're looking at the movement of the edge, but also the shape of the edge. And that's as far as we go.
Okay.
But it's a good question. It's like, where's the wave? Well, the movement itself is a wave. Every movement can be described as a wave. Okay, so this is a desktop version of Supraliminal, and what we're looking at here is a blank memory screen. Each pixel on the screen just remembers itself, and it says, I'm gray, I'm gray, I'm gray. And then we're now introducing into this memory screen an event. And the event is that there's an edge at which the color changes. It looks something like this. So we now have this edge coming through, and it's saying everything after the edge is going to be black. Now we're going to introduce another edge Here's a gray edge, and it's coming from the other side. And when they collide, they will influence each other. And so these are one-dimensional waves. They just go through like this. And you can predict kind of the moment where they will collide, and in the final version, we actually make music when the collision happens. And now they're overlaying each other. So maybe we try this with a different color, maybe like this. And now we have a black wave and a white wave colliding. Let's see what happens here. And now there's 3 waves, and these 3 waves together already create a fairly complex shape. You see how it just emerged there? And so some kinds of interactions are, there we go, mutual, and the 2 colors influence each other. And so these are one-dimensional waves, but now let's add some multi-dimensional waves and see what happens then. This has a slight curvature in it, and the slight curvature and a slight change in the value. Here it's dark, here it's light, here it's dark. So these slight changes in value are a secondary curve that gets carried across the memory. So now we do another curve here, and it's really the same thing as we had before, but suddenly all these crazy patterns start emerging. And that is how morphogenesis works. You have simple things interacting with each other, and they have complex results. And suddenly it's like all hell breaks loose, and all these patterns pop up, and they influence each other, and it's almost like an echo chamber. It becomes really rich and complex so quickly. And then we can say, okay, let's calm this down again. We can simply turn the wave off, and it stopped right there. And I put a simpler wave in, and immediately the patterns change and calm down. You also see how these are continuous patterns, but they get broken down into discrete patterns sometimes. So here's a subtle wave of dark, light, dark, but depending on what it collides into, it turns into not a continuous change of color, but a discrete change of color of on-off. And that's the same kind of mechanism that we use when we speak. For example, when I say you, that's a sound, that's a wave. But when I say you hear it and you understand Y-O-U. You turn it back into its discrete elements. So we go back and forth between waves and categories all the time. So here's a continuity, and then here you have a category of like blue, dark brown, blue. And so that back and forth of category and wave is, this is data genesis. This is how we make things. This is how things emerge in the world. And so it's beautiful to see. It's almost like a little laboratory of forms. And sometimes it gets really pretty, and we're like, okay, then we can save it and say, okay, this one's really good. And we can stop it right there and say, yeah, that one's interesting. And then it becomes a fixed memory, but until then it's a stream, a continuous stream of events.